Do you think that these types of things are already being created? Because when I hear that, I go, shit, that might take 9,000 years to build. Do you think that these things are already being worked on? Obviously, we know that they've thrown around this idea of a digital dollar, but do you think they have a black budget, $10 trillion black budget situation with a bunch of coders that Jack Dorsey pulls out to go work for them that are building these things right now? Or do you think this is purely conceptual and they're just saying, hey, let's do this Fed wallet idea? Or in your opinion, is this something that behind the scenes on a agency we know nothing about that's being built?
Well, I don't know that you'd have to build a lot of it to achieve their objectives. Now, let's shelf the AI stuff and the whole,
right.
What we're talking about.
Yeah, let's talk about the earlier stuff on the monetary. And
that I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm not an AI person. I have no idea if
makes sense.
Private sector, they have that type of technology already, or if that's years down the road. I have no clue, so I couldn't comment on that. But as far as banning cash and then moving to this digital dollar, I don't think that would be hard at all, because the Fed already has the ability to have accounts, because the primary dealer banks have accounts, and there's a lot of other banks that have accounts with the Fed right now, so that wouldn't be difficult. Obviously they'd probably have to staff up quite a bit if there was 300 million of these accounts, but I think that that's doable. And then they can already create bank reserves. That's not a technological challenge. They just go to a keyboard and type in more numbers into a XYZ bank account. So that's super easy to do. Then it's about, okay, well, how would you as an American be able to spend the money that the Fed was putting into your account? So they'd be putting bank reserves into your account, but then you could take and spend those bank reserves as though it was legal tender. So it's just all code. So I think that they just set up the merchants to where they have a little machine. Yeah, I mean, you see them in Starbucks. You just run Apple Pay or anything, or Google Pay, and it's pretty much the same type of thing, where it just scans it, and the business has an account with the Fed as well. Remember that. So it's just a transaction that's happening between one account at the Fed and the other account with the Fed. And keep in mind, the same thing happens now. Right. And so let's maybe back up and walk through this a little bit here. And I don't think most people really have connected these dots. But so if you go down to Starbucks right now, and let's say Starbucks, the local Starbucks has an account with Wells Fargo, and that's their business account. And let's say you have an account with a personal account with Bank of America, and you go down and you buy your $5 coffee from Starbucks. So what happens in that transaction? So, well, there's a couple things that happen. The deposit, the $5 that is a deposit of yours or a liability of the commercial banking system is moved from your account at Bank of America to Starbucks account. And of course, they have to batch and do all these things. But the net result is that $5 of deposit, or more importantly, a liability of the commercial banking system, because that's what a deposit is, it moves from B of A, your account with B of A, to Starbucks account with Wells Fargo. But let's think about this. They're transferring a bank liability. Okay, so if they transferred bank liabilities, now all of a sudden, the receiving bank, because they're receiving a liability, they could be in a negative equity position if they don't receive a corresponding asset. Okay, right. So what happens is that deposit goes, that's the liability, the $5. But what happens at the Fed is there's $5 of bank reserves, and that's an asset of the bank, that goes from B of A to Wells Fargo. So there's two things that happen there. The liability or the deposit goes from B of A to Wells Fargo, and reserves, bank reserves held at the Fed for the same amount, the same $5, goes from B of A to Wells Fargo. You see, so there's a liability and an asset that moves from one bank to the other. Think about how many times that happened. That's every single transaction that we do using a debit card in the United States, or a check in the United States. So that happens a billion times a day, something like that. So that it's already happening. And the exact same thing would happen if we had an account with the Fed, but it would actually be a little bit easier, because then there wouldn't be a corresponding liability. It would just be that asset on the Fed's balance sheet, or a liability for the Fed, just going back and forth from account to an account, right? So it'd actually be easier. So then the question becomes, okay, what about the tech? You'd have to have an app on your phone that would correspond to your account with the Fed. I don't think that's very hard. And I've got a Wells Fargo account, or app right on my phone, and that pretty much corresponds. Now, yes, there's not a barcode where I can spend money directly, but I don't know that would be too challenging for them. And then they just have to have a way of accepting it, and that's it. Because as far as the Fed putting, let's say, $2,000 a month in every single account for stimulus or UBI or helicopter money, whatever you want to call it, it's just doing the exact same thing they're already doing when they do quantitative easing, and they buy a treasury from JP Morgan. And to buy that treasury, they just go to JP Morgan's reserve account with the Fed and just type in another $1 billion to pay for those treasuries. And it would be the exact same thing that they would do for all of our accounts if they wanted to credit our accounts for UBI or stimulus or whatever they wanted to do to increase the money supply in the real economy. Because again, remember, they need to create inflation. So why do they need to create inflation? Because that's another way to bail out the federal government. Assuming the federal government can't generate enough tax revenue to handle their debt load once it gets to a certain point, then they would have to have some sort of inflation, because then it reduces the debt burden on the debtor, because they can pay the debt down with devalued currency, right? So to understand that, I think it's easiest if you just take it to an extreme. If you buy a house right now, and let's say you take out $100,000 mortgage, and the house is $100,000, let's say. Well, that now you are the debtor. Just like the United States government has 27 trillion on balance sheet debt, they are the debtor, right? So same thing. So what ends up happening over 10 years, let's say we get hyperinflation. And at the end of 10 years, let's just say that you've just made interest payments or something. Let's say you still owe the $100,000 of principal that you took out at the beginning to buy the house in the first place. Well, but let's say we have this hyperinflation to now $100,000 only buys you a loaf of bread. Well, what you can do is you can basically pay off your entire loan with the same amount of money you would have paid to buy a loaf of bread. But now all of a sudden you own the house. And the house, the underlying asset, has the same amount of purchasing power. It can buy the same amount of goods and services that it could have purchased 10 years prior when you bought it. You see, so let's say the house, when you bought it initially, could have bought whatever. Let's say it could buy 100,000 loaves of bread, right? So at the end, when you pay it off, it can still buy 100,000 loaves of bread, but you paid off your debt with the equivalent of one loaf of bread. So all of those other loaves of bread was a transfer of wealth or purchasing power from the bank, from the lender to the borrower. You see, because they're paying it back with cheaper devalued dollars, right? And it's the exact same thing. That's why the government would like to get inflation. So when Powell comes out and says that they're moving their inflation target to 2%, to a 2% average or some nonsense like this, and you're kind of scratching your head and you're saying to yourself, boy, that doesn't make any sense. Why do they want me to pay higher prices? Like, why is that a good thing? Why is that a good thing if we as Americans go down to the grocery store and every time we go to the grocery store, the bill's higher? How does that make us richer? right? Well, it doesn't. The only thing it does is bail out the government because they're paying their nominal debt back with cheaper dollars. See, so again, my point is that's another way that they could create inflation, which the government has to have in order to maintain this charade and to continue to kick the can down the road.
So what you're saying here is it's very possible that legal tender will be loaves of bread in the near future, and we'll go into the bank and I'm making a joke.
Not necessarily.
I'm just making a joke.
Yeah, not necessarily that, but like when I go down to Colombia, I spend a lot of time there, and a common bill is a 50,000 peso bill. Okay, well that buys you lunch, right? But think about that. I mean, when Colombia, when they set up the peso in the first place, did they start off by saying, okay, well, we want lunch to cost 50,000 pesos? Did we just like all these zeros on here for no reason at all? No, of course not. It started off as a 5. And they added another 0, 50. Now they added another 0, 500. Now it's 5,000. You see where that goes? Now it's 50,000, but it still just buys you lunch.
So what has to happen? What do you think has to happen for them to get to that position? I mean, I thought that they would I thought they would say your coronavirus spreads on dollars, so we have to immediately make them illegal for public health. That's what I thought was going to happen. It didn't. What do you think has to happen to get to that, to this stage that you're talking about there?
I think there's several things they can do. And unfortunately, I think that we're going to bring it upon ourselves. Like we're going to want it. I mean, as an example, I was looking at my Twitter feed today, and the people on my Twitter feed are very, very libertarian. They don't like the Fed. Most of them, they want the free market capitalism. And I was talking about the Banking for All Act, getting around the commercial banking system and potentially putting the banks out of business. And this individual responded to one of my tweets. He says, "Oh, that's fantastic. We need to get rid of the banksters." I'm like, no. Be careful what you wish for, my friend. You're going from the frying pan into the fire. And so I think that, or let's look at it from a standpoint of stimulus.
That's what I was going to say. It's an interesting problem reaction solution. When a bunch of people don't have jobs, you can, and everyone, online, I mean, you see people that are normally fiscally conservative that are basically begging for money right now.
Yeah, right. So you say, okay, if you want your stimulus check, well, you just have to download the Fed app, and then we're just going to set up this awesome, super cool, convenient bank account for you with the Fed. Oh, fantastic. Great. How do I sign up?
Yeah.
There's going to be no connecting the dots saying, wait a minute, if the Fed has my bank account, all my information, then it could lead to this, and this. Like people, all they see is just free money. And like, okay, what do I need to do to get it? Okay, done. That's what I'm going to do to get my free money. And so I think that, and then of course, at some point, I think you're right in principle. Maybe they're not going to say we're going to ban cash because it's dirty, but whatever excuse they use to ban cash, it's going to be for your safety. It's always for your safety. That's how they get everything through.
I guess they could even say
the drug dealers are using it, the terrorists are using it, and for your own safety, we're going to ban cash, or for your own convenience. And at a certain point, people are just going to be like, yeah, it's a no-brainer. Why do we need this stupid cash? I don't want it. And here, take it. And then they give it back to the bank. The bank sends it to the Fed, and then the Fed just incinerates it. And then, and it might not happen overnight.
Yeah.
It might be something like, like we use change now. I mean, very few people, I mean, you get change every once in a while, but you kind of throw it in a bag. You don't really use it too often. You don't carry it around in your pocket. And maybe it's just gradual progression that we use less and less and less and less cash until we get to a point where we're like, okay, we're done. And maybe that's 2 or 3 years. But I think once the politicians start to think it through and understand how much power this gives them, I think you're going to see the progression happen a lot faster. And if you look at the agenda that the World Economic Forum has, I mean, a lot of it's kind of digital currency based, but of course they don't want anything that's decentralized like Bitcoin. They want the complete opposite of that. They want something that's totally centralized that they would control and be able to micromanage.